You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in the show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour. The Hoosier Humanist Hour is brought to you by volunteers from FreeThought Fort Wayne, Incorporated. We're in affiliation with the American Humanist Association. The Hoosier Humanist Hour is a show dedicated to discussions on all things humanism and or from the humanist perspective. But really, we'll talk about just about anything, so long as we could talk about a humanist view on that subject. Today's topic, I'm hoping to broadly cover as much about moral and ethical systems as possible. So today, I'm joined by Chris and Dee, and we also have Andrew in the background. How you guys doing?
Really good.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I suppose one place to start. Where to start? That's the question here, at least that I struggled with. Where do you start when you want to talk about moral and ethical systems? And really, I thought that the best place to start would be to try to talk about what morality and ethics even are. So to begin, I thought it'd be best to talk about ethics. There are three categories of ethics. One is called normative ethics. This is essentially there to tell us what we ought to do and why we should do it. There's meta-ethics, which is the study of ethical theory itself. And there's applied ethics, which describes what happens when we apply normative ethics to specific issues. So when you're looking at all these, really what we're going to be discussing today are normative ethics and meta-ethics for the most part, because this is really the foundation of morality and where it really comes from. And when we talk about morality, I think it's important to discuss what exactly we're talking about. There are certain views of what morality is in and of itself that two people can be having a conversation about morality and agreeing and disagreeing and whatnot, but they might not even be talking about the same thing. So where I think the conversation should begin is by asking, how do we know if an action falls into the moral sphere at all? How can we distinguish between whether something is moral, immoral, or amoral, or if amoral even exists? But we'll get to that in a moment. So I thought before we broach this, I thought I'd kind of ask you guys, when you think about morality, how do you decide whether something is moral, amoral, or immoral?
Would I do it to somebody else?
Sure.
The
golden rule, essentially?
Yeah, essentially the golden rule. That's pretty much my only code of morality.
Okay, yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. The golden rule is pretty universal.
I have reasons for that. It's not like, my mom taught me that and that's what I do. I have thought through reasons for that. But yeah, that's it for me.
Okay. Well, basically, what I'm getting at here is I'm trying to get everybody to kind of think about, how they even make this distinction in the first place. Now, there are basically two ways to go about doing this. You can look towards some divine answer, which is where most people get their ethics and morality from, or you can look from within human nature. This is where humanists get their morality from. Not just humanists, but just throwing that out there. And what this really means is that there are different moral paradigms. There are different places from which people derive their morality. And this is one of the reasons why you find that people can have radically different moral opinions on things as well. So, for example, I think the best two examples to give on the moral spectrum that kind of describe the broadness of this. Would be to talk about utilitarianism, versus absolutism. Now, in my mind, these two are about as far apart as you can be on the spectrum. So if we imagine absolutism on the left and utilitarianism on the right, I would assume, based on everything that I know, that most other, if not all other, ethical codes fall within that. So utilitarianism is essentially the approach that every action should be to maximize well-being for the most sentient beings possible, essentially, in a nutshell. Now, there are different variations on utilitarianism. I'm sorry, gosh, I keep saying that wrong. Utilitarianism. But by and large, that's generally what it means. And then you have the other end of the spectrum here, absolutism, which states that every action is innately negative or positive. Now, what this means is that the circumstances that lead up to and the effects thereof have absolutely no effect on its moral implications. So what this is essentially saying, to simplify things further, is that there exists in some way, if you can imagine, an absolute right and wrong that never changes, and it is what it is for various reasons. And most people fill in this gap. Well, why? Why is it just right and wrong? With things like, for example, divine command theory. That which is good because God says it's good, et cetera, et cetera. Now, humanism, I would say, leans obviously much more towards the utilitarian end of the spectrum. We don't look towards divine inspiration to try to figure out what's right and what's wrong. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, what makes it far more superior to pretty much any other, if not all other, forms of ethics and morality. And so I'll just kind of pass the ball along here to one of you guys. What are your opinions on humanism and how it's applied? Like, how do you see what do you think the benefits of humanism are, and why they're benefits? Why it's superior to other forms around it? Why you chose humanism?
Chris, you got this one?
Well, I don't know. After going to the humanist conference, it kind of confused me a little bit, because some of the behaviors I saw there were not very humanist, at least my idea of humanist. And so it was frustrating to me. And it helped make me realize that the humanist idea is an idea that's actually a merger of two different ideas. One of which is exactly what you said, which is to say a genetic or hereditary basis for morality and ethics. The other is the intersection of that with culture. Okay, so between those two things, genetics, heredity, basically evolution, and culture, between those two, we can easily come across some pretty good ideas for what is moral or ethical. We do not need any sort of divine intervention to necessarily mandate any of that for us.
Yeah, but you can have, would you say that there's not wrong morals or wrong ethical behavior within the culture? Even though it may serve the culture that you're in, maybe on a larger scale, it doesn't. Like maybe overconsumption, for instance, in your culture is okay and considered a moral good, but eventually you're going to consume all of your natural resources and kill yourself. So it would ultimately be an immoral behavior, right?
Right, and that comes to the relativism of some of these bits of what is right and wrong. Yes.
Would you say that humanism is like is there any part of humanism that leans toward absolutism?
Honestly, I can't think of anything. Humanism, in my mind, really is the best solution that we have towards coming up with systems of ethics and morality that work and that make the most people as as prosperous as possible and as happy as possible.
But
The problem that I've seen and saw at the conference was the fact that humanism is being embraced by a number of people who are extreme leftists.
Yes, that's exactly where I'm going with this too.
Which is the problem, because of the fact that when you take this stance that anything that is artificial or unnatural is bad, that's retarded. You need to reevaluate your priorities in life. So, I mean, you even have the same division of politics that come in even within like this narrow sphere of a moral code. But anyway, continue on. I interrupted you.
No, you're fine. I'm going to slow down. First of all, I think that what's going on here with this extreme left incursion into humanism, at least they're waving the banner of humanism, is I believe that these people are humanism plus, that they take it to extremes that are just superfluous, unnecessary. And I think that because of that, their passion, their vigor about certain issues, my least favorite being this pronoun issue, that people should be obligated or should feel obligated to call somebody by a particular pronoun that they prefer. I think first, I don't want to get into the political realm of that, but my point being is that isn't humanism. That's humanism plus. That's something else. That no humanism's no line or dot or tittle in the humanist ethics code that I'm aware of.
The manifesto?
The manifesto. There you go. Thank you. I forgot the word. No line in the Humanist Manifesto that I'm aware of says that this should be an inevitable outcome. Period. Nor do I see anything that reflects the notion that this should even be warranted or a concern for humanists. I just don't see it. And that's one of the... I don't know, honestly, where they're getting this from is my thing.
But they're convinced that they're right, though. So I guess we could have the second humanists of Fort Wayne, or the second humanists of. We could start our own sect of humanism.
Let them start their own sect. I want to maintain my conservative humanist values. Well, it is. I mean, I've actually been approaching humanism politically more so than as a philosophy when I approach people.
Well, do you feel like you can give me like a reasonable definition of what you think humanism is, or can you only box it in by telling me what it isn't?
No, sure, absolutely.
I'm curious, Chris, I would love to hear yours too, Chris. Anyway.
Well, humanism is the idea that we should use reason and logic and science to determine things, to figure things out. And this includes things like morality. And we ignore as much as possible we ignore everything that pertains to any claims of the supernatural. So when we try to determine what ought or ought not to be done, we have to derive this conclusion based on empirical data, based on real world situations, and thus are more likely to produce a more accurate conclusion about what's happening here. And so, for example, with ethics, because we don't look towards a divine being, that we look towards our own history, our genetic history, and so forth, all of this stuff, we can know for certain that handing somebody a glass of arsenic is wrong, and not because it was decreed by some being on high, but because giving somebody arsenic is not in that person's best interest. It is not going to increase their well-being and is going to harm them. And at that point, then the only thing left to discuss is bickering about, well, what's harm and why should harm matter? But in my opinion, every conversation about morality is a conversation about well-being.
Yeah, okay, let me take that example and say, well, maybe there can you imagine any scenario in which handing somebody a glass of arsenic would be a good thing?
If they wanted to die.
Yeah, okay, so there you go. So there must be a deeper ethical framework.
Well, sure,
that you have to
but
base that on.
humanism doesn't necessarily say that handing a person a glass of arsenic in and of itself is an evil action or an immoral act.
So what you're saying is that humanism is a way to step away from absolutism and into relativism.
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent way to state that. I agree, 100%. Thank you. Does that satisfy your answer?
I think so. I think it has a way of becoming its own absolutism or absolute moral code. Anyway, Chris. What can you define it for you? Like, what struck you as being weird when you went to the convention? Like, why did it rub you the wrong way? You must have a version in your head that's different than theirs.
There are a number of things that rubbed me the wrong way at that convention, and fortunately, some of the other members in our entourage that went there, of the 6 people that went there, at least some of them got to witness some of that. So it is unfortunate, and honestly, it made me question whether I even wanted to come to one of these conferences, because I saw so much dilution of this conference and sway by the extreme left. And I really didn't care for that, because so much of it was absolutism, and so much of it was it was coming from a perspective that was not exactly very friendly. It was actually kind of hostile. And I didn't care much for that. I think that was honestly just because of the theme of the conference. I kind of blame that, because the theme of the conference was more catered towards less represented groups, groups that have frequently, as of late, been under fire. So people of the LGBT crowd, people of minority races and such. That's really what dominated everything, whether it be gender or gay or whatever. That's really kind of what dominated it. And normally I wouldn't have a problem with that, but the take that a number of these people took was very very demeaning in a number of ways, and I just really didn't care for it, to be honest. Like, encouraging equality is one, encouraging everyone to be equal is one thing, but specifically encouraging inequality is something completely different.
Absolutely.
So I saw a lot of white hating at this particular conference.
Yeah, I've been noticing a lot more chatter about white and black and us and them that don't necessarily pertain to religion. I like what you're talking about here, the LGBTQ plus whatever. Apparently, I'm a cis something or other. I had no idea. This is news to me. Apparently, my whole life I've been a cis. And to me, I think that there is a way to just shoot this down completely. I think that an argument could be made that such extreme left values are actually anti-humanist, to kind of get these people outside of the humanist bandwagon. Because in my mind, I think that in the grand scheme of things, what you're going to find is that the well-being of the population by and large, is going to go down when you start restricting personal liberties, and thus making it anti-humanistic in that. You are going against human values at that point. There are other arguments to be made as well, but that's just the first place that my mind goes. I mean, what you're going to do is decrease the level of happiness in the society that you're in when you force them to speak a certain way. End of story.
Honestly, that was a great. Thank you for reminding me of that. That was a great example at the conference. Was that there were a couple times where a person or a panel would finish a talk and people would come up for questions, and they got to a point where they just actually started taking all the white people out of the line for questions and telling them to go sit down.
What?
They got that bad? It's that bad?
What?
I'm sorry. I felt like that was inappropriate.
Absolutely inappropriate. That is absurd to me. This happened at a humanist concert?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, conference?
Yeah.
That is unbelievable. Well, who was in charge of that particular segment? Was the whole conference set up this way, or was it just this particular person, or a couple of people were there?
There were a couple of people who were really rallying behind this movement that whites didn't have a right to come up and say anything with regard to minority issues. There were a couple of people rallying for that, and I got to talk with a couple of those people. And I'm sorry, those people, whether at the conference itself or at the bar or whatever, they really didn't exhibit what I would consider to be humanist values, whether on the stage or off the stage. And I was really upset that they were even there at the conference.
Are you guys familiar with this implicit bias, with what it is?
Implicit bias?
Yes.
No, I don't believe so.
You should look it up, and it's kind of this newer thing that they've discovered, and they have these experiments and observations that really back it up, and it basically is proof that there's bias built into the culture. Now, I'm not saying that nobody thought that wasn't the case. It's just it's quantified it in a certain way that's made it really stand out. And you can see how this bias is built into the culture and in our minds in ways that do affect these other races. And I'm not saying that people argue against that. I'm sure some people do. But when you can quantify it and really see how it affects people and what it means, it changes the way that you view the divides amongst ethnicities and that sort of stuff. And I think that might be what's fueling a lot of it. But anyway, if you guys are...
Absolutely, I could see it. I mean, when I was growing up, all I got was Fox News, Fox. That was my implicit bias. So as far as I was concerned, the whole world was that. And when I got to finally start watching what I wanted to watch, I didn't want to watch Fox. Nobody wants. Well, screw Fox. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but I don't do Fox anymore. I have a lot of different media outlets that I embrace now because I realized very quickly that I was believing in thinking that I knew things that really were not the case because of the people I associated with. I'm talking evangelistic Christians, mid-40s, California, 90s, all watching Fox News, every one of them, I tell you. And that was just where I got all my information about the world was from these people. This was my community.
Yeah.
But, okay, but yeah, that implicit bias, that's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is. We should do a show on it because I think we could just, if you could just understand the topic briefly, I think it would naturally bring up a lot of conversation points. But there's some really interesting experiments that they've done with it, and I wish I would try to explain it, but I'll just botch it entirely. So, but anyway, that's a side note that I've taken way too far.
That's fine. Okay, so
I'll give you my. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go for it.
I was going to say I'll give you my idea of what humanism is, if that helps the conversation proceed. It's just whatever's good for humans, in aggregate, and on the individual level. Even knowing that certain things are going to be bad for individuals, but good for the greater good, and that's where there's no ultimate way to judge that. We just make the best choices we can, and democracy is the way in which we've chosen to do that. And I think that that's probably the best way to do it, considering. The downsides of democracy tend to be less brutal than the downsides of other forms of doing it, other ways of doing it. But that's it. Everything can be judged by that. So that basically brings up the golden rule: do unto others as you would have done unto you, with that idea in mind that whatever's in the greatest good for humanity in general is.
See, I'm down for what you're saying and everything, but at the same time, Jesus implemented the golden rule as well. So the golden rule alone, in my mind, is useful, but I think it's a good place to start. For the golden rule to really be effective, you really need to live in a world where such a thing called categorical imperatives exists. Categorical imperatives were thought up by Immanuel Kant in the 1700s. At the very least, he was the first one to pen this. And essentially, what this is we would have to live in a world where this absolute moral code could exist, and that everybody applies it. It basically is some sort of idealist utopia, if you will. To me, like I said, I think it's a great place to start. I feel that it's really necessary if you care. I mean, honestly, for those of you who might be listening, I think I'm just being nitpicky, but I mean, if you really care about what really is right, wrong, and why, I think that it would be good to scratch on the surface of that and say, ask the question that any theist would ask you. Well, why should we care what is in the best interest for human beings? Why is that or more? So you start asking why questions, and that's where you get into the meta-ethics that we discussed earlier, the study of ethical theory itself, why things are good or bad. Yes,
I agree. You're going to have that, though, in any ethical system, aren't you? The meta-ethics?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I would hope you would. In my mind, I think this would be a great transition we can make here. I don't believe in an absolute morality. In fact, I go so far as to say that I'm a moral nihilist, in that I believe that morality is a human contrivance. It's completely made up. It's useful and it works, but it's not a real thing, and thus is subject to change.
And you're saying that it's completely this. That there's nothing in it that is.
I don't.
I'm sorry, you broke up there. What did you say?
Yes, I agree with you. I'm sorry. That's what I'm saying. Yes, I don't believe that morality is anything other than what we make it. In a word, in a nutshell, I suppose that it doesn't exist any more than the God of Spinoza exists. It's there. It's a real force in the world. It impacts societies and civilizations throughout time, good and bad. But it doesn't actually exist. It's just this thing that we made up. And
it doesn't exist like math, or.
That's actually an interesting question. Does it not exist in the same way that math or numbers, I would assume?
Or any kind of.
I think what you're just getting at is that it's an abstract concept.
Yeah. Simply put, there you go.
But it is an abstract concept that is quantifiable.
Yeah.
When you say
I can agree with that.
When you say that it's entirely made up, is that just because without humans here in the cosmos, assuming there's no other intelligent life, then there would be no need for morality as even.
Well, I wouldn't go that far even. I think that morality is, again, what we make it. So, for example, he was talking about how we can quantify morality, and this is actually being done all the time. There are researchers and biologists that try to study ethics of the animal kingdom, gorillas or cheetahs, you name it. They're actually trying to study ethical systems that exist within these animal kingdoms, or whatever you want to call them. And in order to do that, they have to create some sort of barometer, some way to measure this. But as far as we know, the only way we can do this is by comparing our own values to their way of life, their existence in general. So if humans didn't exist, it's possible that morality would still exist in the animal kingdom. If all life ceased to exist, then yes, I would agree that morality doesn't exist in a universe where life doesn't exist.
But morality must be present where life exists, or at least intelligent life. It's kind of like if you have a star, it's going to have a color. It's just inherent in having an existence. So because humans exist, morality does exist. And there must be some sort of
The concept of
measure
of
as to what is
morality
good or
can
better or
exist.
not good.
Yeah, for the most part. The only thing I would change is that morality can exist so far as there are things that can conceive of morality.
But we can't exist without morality.
Or, excuse me, that can be influenced by moral behavior. So, for example, I should actually phrase that differently. So, again, things that influence that are influenced by moral behavior. So, for example, if you could imagine two of the most feral human tribes possible, you have one group that knows how to make arrowheads and nothing else. They barely are able to maintain cohesion within their own little tribe. And then you have another little troop that's in a similar situation, but they know how to make, jackets really well. With no communication whatsoever beyond visual cues. These two people would, if they want to interact peacefully, would need to incorporate something which we don't necessarily need to talk about, but I'll just briefly mention, known as social contract theory. And this basically states that in order for cooperation to exist, there need to be social contracts, known or unknown. They can be subconscious or conscious, but they need to exist in some way in order for cohesion to exist in any way within tribes, or I can't think of the word here. With animals that hang out in groups, herd mentality, excuse me. In order to even have anything like a herd mentality, you need to have some form of cooperation. I mean, even bees need some form of cooperation in order to do what they do. And if you break it down, I mean, all of these require some sort of moral decision to be made, something that's going to benefit or harm others. And generally, a species wants to benefit its own species as much as possible in order to procreate. So these unspoken bonds often get created. You see the cooperation within bees. It would be, for example, I would imagine in the bee realm, immoral for a bee to hog all the pollen to himself. But that might not necessarily be immoral if bees weren't in a herd mentality. So it's extremely nuanced and painful to talk about.
Oh, it's very interesting.
But in a nutshell, I'll just kind of summarize here, and we can get back to our opinions on the matter. Social contract theory basically states that, to kind of summarize, we are everything that cooperates has to have some sort of cohesion, social cohesion in the form of a social contract. I won't kill you, as I just want to give you these arrowheads for those jackets. I don't want to kill you. I just want to give you these jackets for those arrowheads. As long as they can somehow get that idea, that concept between the two of them, then that's a social contract being utilized right there. And that's kind of the foundation of all of this. So when you should or shouldn't do certain things. But again, my opinions on whether or not morality exists. When you think about things like this, again, it requires some form of cooperation for these things to exist. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the question is where to draw the line. So do amoeba have moral or ethical systems that we can't quite comprehend? I doubt it. So I got to draw the line a little bit higher. Do fish? Possibly.
Okay.
Schools of fish.
I'm going to interrupt real quick because just on a basic premise, I want to ask this question. Are we trying to equate morality with cooperation?
That's a good, interesting question. It's an interesting way to put it. No. So
is that social cohesion theory that you're trying to explain?
Social contract theory is the backbone of ethics, but morality isn't necessarily cooperation. If that's what your question was. I'm sorry, did that answer your question, Rex?
Sorry. So I guess I was asking it for either, if it's moral or ethical to cooperate.
I would say that ethically, the goal is to create as much cooperation to create the greatest good for the most number of people. I think that it's impossible. Well, I'm just going to leave it there, actually. I think that's good enough.
It just depends on what you know. I think a lot of people don't realize necessarily that there is evidence for cooperation bringing people further than doing things on their own. So I could see how people think that there's not like a moral obligation for cooperation, but I think with a certain amount of knowledge about it, then there is a moral obligation.
Yeah. Well, ethics is extremely nuanced, and there's a lot of different things that tie into ethics, and this is just one of those things. And you can actually, Chris, you actually have an example, whether you know it or not, that kind of gives an example of how cooperation is, in and of itself, going to produce a much greater benefit for the most number of people. We had a conversation a while back about 3D printers and how at one point all the companies were working together on these developing technologies until X happened. Did you remember that story?
Vaguely.
Oh, okay. Well, what you had mentioned was that there was a point in time when 3D printing was in a certain stage of development in its life, where all these big companies and corporations were coming together and cooperating in trying to come up with all of these new innovations for the technology. They weren't creating very many copyrights and trademarks on these things so that they were able to work cohesively together and cooperate friendly. And at some point, for whatever reason, I don't remember why, they stopped doing that. Everybody started patenting what they could so that others couldn't use it. And then you saw a steep decline in how quickly this technology was developing. It's very steep, very harsh decline. And I think if you equate that to the morality end of things, I think what you'll find is the greater amount of cooperation you have, the greater you're going to see results for the most number of people that benefit them. So that's why I would say that this is a factor of ethics and morality, but I wouldn't equate the two. More because morality, like I said, isn't actually a thing. Nor is ethics by that standard, I would imagine. But morality doesn't necessarily even require another thinking agent. For example, well, I don't know. I take that back. Let me think about that statement. I don't know. I think that my standard for what would be amoral, something that doesn't have a moral implication, would be something that an action that doesn't affect another thinking agent. As far as I'm concerned, that should cover all of the amoral spectrum. So that being said, if there are no thinking agents, morality can't exist. So there you go. That's kind of how I would summarize my thoughts.
That's an interesting way of putting it.
So what would constitute unethical?
Unethical would be something that harms a thinking agent. That, I guess that's good enough for me too. Something that harms a thinking agent would be something that is unethical or immoral. Or at the very least, something that impedes the progress of a thinking agent or the well-being of a thinking agent, at the very least.
Because I guess the further along in this discussion we get, the more I start to see morals and ethics kind of fading together and intermingling.
Absolutely. This is one of those points where this is where applied ethics comes in. I'll just say that. I mean, this, again, just kind of recap, this describes what happens when we apply normative ethics, normative ethics being that which tells us what we ought to do and why. So what I'm discussing is my views on humanism, and I'm applying these ethics to try to find the logical conclusion to my morality as well, because I use humanism as my paradigm, and I kind of just see where that takes me. Well, your
idea of your idea of humanism is kind of Spock-like.
Sure.
Like,
I would agree.
Is that a fair observation?
I honestly, yes. I think that's a pretty fair observation. Now, there are philosophical systems that say that we should live by pure logic alone. I don't necessarily think we should live purely by logic. That's why I think that reason is so important. Don't get me wrong, reason and logic go hand in hand, but not everything is so cut and dry that logic can really splice it out, in my opinion. Logic is a useful tool for helping to develop these things, and should be one of the, if not the primary tool. But for example, I don't know.
Isn't that like a kind of like a form of absolutism?
I'm
really going to make it complicated now.
Are my views, in what way? Can you kind of spell it out a little bit?
You are basically making logic your standard, like the standard by which everything should be judged.
Okay.
I can understand your argument for that. I mean, there's a lot of things that I would probably fall in that camp too, but that's just our opinion. There's other people who believe that maybe beauty should be the standard by which things should be judged.
That's an excellent point as well. There are several different moral paradigms. Can you think of a particular philosophy or anything like that that you know of that has any sort of moral paradigm along those lines? Because it's an interesting thought. And
kind of like hedonism, like whatever brings the most pleasure.
Okay.
I don't know if hedonism is the right term, but just to live for pleasure, whatever brings the most pleasure.
Whatever. Okay, so that's an interesting one as well. I think that really what it amounts to is what are we talking about? Again, this is why this should be the first conversation we have. What are we talking about when we're talking about morality? When I talk about morality, I'm talking about well-being. And how can we determine what's going to bring the most well-being for the most people, and specifically, anyway. What you're describing that's not the paradigm at all. What you're describing is a completely different moral paradigm where pleasure, specifically one's own pleasure, is the moral paradigm. So when you're having a conversation, if you guys don't have that conversation about why you think that pleasure should be your paradigm, or why well-being for the most number of people should be my paradigm, if you don't have that conversation and you just start talking about talking about this should be good or this should be bad, rather, you're not going to make any progress whatsoever. You guys are going to have two totally different conversations, essentially.
In fact, you're actually going to have a divorce at that point.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike.
Well, excuse me. Well, if you seem to have a slightly different opinion on this, David. Where would you say you derive your morality from? I mean, I know you said the golden rule, but I mean, have you ever really given it much thought? The golden rule is just
the application of it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have, but what the hell do I know?
Well, it's fine. I'm not trying to poke at you.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think that I'm a pretty smart guy, but reality is what choice do you have other than to think that when you look in the mirror, right? It's hard to look at yourself in the mirror and be like, God, you're really dumb. I think most people think, that they've got something to offer, but I can't find any kind of like ultimate morality. I just know that we should, or any kind of ultimate ethical system. I think that there's certain things that we can throw out, but the highest morality is to make sure that morality continues to exist and progress.
Well, have you ever? That's it. I'm sorry to interrupt. Have you ever seen a lecture by Sam Harris or read the book on his take on morality? How he describes the spectrum and how you can move along this spectrum? Sam Harris?
No, I have not.
Okay. Well, I highly recommend that for you then. If you're having trouble trying to just figure out what should be the best moral system. I agree with Sam
I've
Harris
already.
on a
I
lot
feel
of
like I've
issues.
already made up my mind on that. Like, I cannot find any higher morality.
Well, that's
I'm
fine.
not saying that. I'm not saying that I live up to that morality every time, but I cannot find any higher morality than the continuation of morality and its progress, which implies humanity and civilization and all that stuff. So that's it. That's as simple as I can make it, which is pretty damn broad. But the problem is the more specific you get with it, the more exceptions you find. So I try to like keep it as broad as I can. And so the only practical morality I can find is the golden rule. That is the only practical morality.
If I can just take an aside here, this was actually brought up on our Facebook page sometime in the last 2 months, as far as the golden rule, as was mentioned by one of our esteemed commenters on the FreeThought pages. She brought up the golden rule, and somebody amongst the FreeThought staff actually responded with a great answer and helped remind that kind commenter that the golden rule is actually, when you look at it, a very selfishly based kind of paradigm. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. It's you-centered. It shouldn't be you-centered. It should be them-centered. The golden rule is garbage because it's a completely selfish way to look at life. You need to look at everyone according to their needs and wants and desires. You don't need to look at everyone as if they're another copy of you, because there's only one you. What you want is not what everybody else wants. Just because I want blueberry pancakes doesn't mean I'm going to serve everyone in the world blueberry pancakes. Okay? That's not what the golden rule is supposed to be. The golden rule is supposed to be treat others as they want to be treated. Some people want to be left alone, so leave them alone. Some people want to be talked to, so talk to them.
Isn't that the same thing, really, though?
No, two very different
like
connotations.
Really, because I feel like I follow the golden rule, and I do that very same thing that you're talking about. I would never in my life force other people or think that they should eat blueberry pancakes.
Well,
so, I mean, maybe I'm just saying it in a certain way, but I don't know anybody who kind of thinks of the golden rule the way that I'm thinking of it, would think in terms that you're describing.
But that would be a different interpretation than what the words literally suggest. See what I'm saying?
Okay, I got you.
Mm-hmm.
So you're taking a very literal point of view,
right,
on it. No,
you have to be very careful with that.
No, you're absolutely right. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with you, Chris. In fact, I would go so far as to say I think that at this point, the golden rule could be considered a categorical imperative. It really only would work absolutely if everybody applied it. And again, it's possible that everybody could lean that way, but I doubt it. That's why, David, you were talking about your search for an absolute morality. This is why I don't believe in an absolute morality. I don't think that it exists. And I think that we can know this by simply looking at morality and how it's changed over the years and why it's changed over the years. And just come to the conclusion that morality is going to change. It's going to continue to change. It's going to be dependent on the environment, on the people, on the culture, etc. It's never going to be static. And I highly, highly doubt that it's even going to get to a point where the entire human race is under a single ethical system. So because of that, I think the best way that we can go about trying to get along with each other is by doing what Chris had suggested. Just treat people the way you think they would like to be treated. That way, those boundaries have a lot of cushion there, because if you apply the golden rule, you might actually annoy some people, as he had mentioned.
Man, you guys make me feel like a total asshole now. I don't feel like I do that with the golden rule. In fact, I don't know anybody who uses the golden rule and actually applies it the way in which you guys are talking. Now, I got to hand it to you that the literal words of the golden rule imply a lot of the things that you're talking about, but I don't believe that that's a moral code that most people live by. Do unto others because my way is the only way in which it should be done. I mean, that's a pretty weak moral code. I've not known many people who live by a moral code like that.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, and really, like what I was saying earlier, I wasn't disagreeing with you by any means or trying to give you much crap for it, because honestly, I agree with you in that I think that those who apply the golden rule, by and large, but the vast majority of them are perfectly fine people to be around. In fact, I would go so far as to say most people on the planet would say that they derive their morality from something like the golden rule. And I'm not going to say that I'm on opposite ends of the spectrum with almost everybody on the planet, or that I couldn't get along with these people. I wouldn't go that far because, like you said, it's a relatively harmless philosophy unless it's applied in the most extreme, quote, fundamentalist way. So I tend not to give it too much.
And speaking of a fundamentalist kind of view here, just going back to the absolute morals and ethics, I feel as though you were starting to touch on something, and I cut you off intentionally because I wanted to say a couple things. So that was my bad for being rude. But I really was having issue with you attacking single-celled organisms and saying that they have no senses of morals or ethics. And the reason why I say that is because even at the cellular level, if you think of a simple eukaryotic cell, that is to say, any other cell on the planet other than bacterium is a eukaryotic cell. So every cell in our bodies is eukaryotic. That is to say, it has a number of other little structures in it that have little functions. One of those structures that's very important in our bodies is the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion has its own DNA. That is one of the ways that we can trace back your maternal lineage much more accurately than we can your nuclear DNA. Which is to say, my maternal lineage comes from the Middle East, and that was determined very, very accurately through genetic testing. Very cool stuff. But that mitochondrion is basically a bacterium that has become symbiotic with the eukaryotic cell. So, every mitochondrion in your cells, basically every way that you get oxygen and break down glucose to create energy, every single one of those things is in some sort of moral and ethical kind of situation where they understand that they provide a service to the cell, to our cells, in exchange for services. And that's a very strict moral and ethical code that if it's not maintained, the cell dies. They both die.
Okay. I would say that this is why I would say that I'm concerned with the implications of actions taken by thinking agents on other thinking agents. I think that what you're describing is, as far as I'm aware, basically nature taking its natural course. There's not even a binary decision, I don't think, being made on a cellular level. Is there? Is there a decision?
No, there is. There is. That's what I'm saying, is that it's a very absolute moral and ethical system. Very absolute. To where if you break it, you're dead. There's no wishy-washiness to it. And that's what I'm getting at, is that in higher level organisms, as you go to a level of tissues, organs, organ systems, and an organism, you start developing further levels of complexity as far as being able to stretch out this moral and ethical code into something that's more relativistic as opposed to absolutist.
Okay. Well, what I would say is at that point, the conversation or the debate would need to be had on where you draw the line on what a thinking agent would be. Here's what I'm getting at, because what you're describing is a very small part of a much larger system that is, in and of itself, morality. So, for example, and this is going to sound abstract, but I'm sorry, I'm hoping this will make sense when I'm all done. Because I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about consciousness briefly because I think this is relevant here.
It is absolutely relevant. I think it's absolutely relevant.
I don't believe that a single neuron could be ever considered conscious. I don't think that even two could be considered conscious. I think that you need a network of neurons, and at that point, it's how many grains of sand make a mound. It's probably an arbitrary decision to determine at what point something could be considered a sentient being of any kind, something that could indeed make a decision, even a binary one. Stay, don't stay. If that's the only decision you make, then as far as I'm concerned, you could be considered a sentient being. And at that point, then you can start diving into the moral realm. But you need all of those. You need not just one neuron, not just one cell. You need a network. And I don't think that a single cell, as you were describing, or even a cell within a cell, or a cell within a cell next to a cell within a cell, it is in and of itself an ethical system, because I don't think that there are any decisions that could be made. But I could be wrong. I'm willing to be proven wrong here.
Chris, you were implying that a decision was being made?
Absolutely. And the reasoning for that
decision. Yeah, how do they know that an actual decision is being made? So this mitochondria could choose to terminate itself and the cell.
Mm-hmm.
So it's continuously making a decision to do that. How do they know that?
It all comes down to the DNA, right? So the DNA is the control center of the cell, and it basically governs everything within the cell. So what I'm saying is that if you can show me an amoeba, just to go back to your example, if you can show me an amoeba whose movements you can predict every single bit of the way for a period of an hour, then I will agree that that is not a sentient being.
That is not a sentient being.
See, so you're drawing the line of sentience at life that may have random action.
Right.
So our idea of having this superior consciousness, like humanity having a superior consciousness, is really just an illusion that we've given ourselves.
Well, I don't know. This is again
that
why
what
I
you're
think
kind of implying there, Chris?
I'm sorry.
I guess what I'm implying is that life itself is based on randomness. And that in order to claim that you can predict, any of these types of things, you have to be able to predict the smallest things that we have, and those are cells or single-celled organisms.
I know this goes into this conversation about free will, but just do you believe in free will? Like, do you believe that there's any scientific evidence for free will? What is your opinion on that? Just briefly, yes or no?
Everything is randomness and everything is governed by the cell, so absolutely free will. Yeah.
Absolutely free will?
Absolutely.
But how can you say that with randomness?
Yep.
How can randomness be?
I think randomness is required for free will.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you live in a deterministic universe, and at that point, you need to have. But here's the thing. Well, guys, I think we're running out of time here, and I just want to thank you guys for this conversation. It's been a lot of fun. It's probably one of the funnest episodes I've had in a long time, and by far one of the most enlightening. I want to encourage not just you guys. I'm encouraging myself, and I want to encourage the listeners as well to think about these things, to think about why you think what's good is good and what's bad is bad. Is it really, or is it just your opinion? Is it an absolute? What do you think? What are your thoughts on it? Really dive in. And I really want to encourage everyone out there as well to fact check everything that we talked about today. I think that a discussion on morality is one of the most important conversations that can be had. And I think having a basic understanding of ethical theory is important. So on that note, we plan on doing another episode on this subject, a part 2. It could be next week, might not. We'll see. It sounds like it could be next week, though. This was a lot of fun.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on Meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.